Ait tan squallowin, hait zapka to ait masteoch to ametstam to Vancouver Playhouse Lalum tanasnet. Hait zapka to ait masteoch to ametstam tanachacha tanasnet nasiam nasiaya. Eaten qual hunkaminum kan. Eaten qual hunkaminum. Ni hai tanashwels kunitamakan. Good evening. We're now in the evening. My honored and respected friends. Welcome back to those who have been here all day, and welcome to everyone who is just now joining us at the symposium today. My name is Christy Charles. I'm the Vancouver Poet Laureate, and I come from these lands. I identify as a Musqueam person. My status card connects me as a 550 to the Musqueam people. But I do hold lineage through the Harry family, through Squamish, through the George family, through Tsleil-Waututh, and to many other families through Kayapalano in the Coast Salish territories. So again, welcome to the traditional territory of the Musqueam people, shared territories with Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh. Thank you to our honored guests for being here this evening. And yeah, let's get started. I'd first like to introduce our representative from the city, Eric Fredrickson. He's the head of public art for the city of Vancouver. Please welcome Eric Heichka.
Thank you, Christy. It's a great honor to be here tonight. I'd like to add my thanks to all of you for being here tonight, and to the presenters this evening, many of whom we're already having really interesting conversations with and we're interested in hearing more from tonight, and to the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh on whose lands we meet, on whose unceded lands we meet. I'm grateful to have this chance to hear from a number of perspectives on the question of reconciliation and cultural redress in public art. Living and working in this city, it's important to think about how we might help to make visible the peoples and the histories and the relationships to the land which have been continually threatened with erasure. This is a question that, of course, goes beyond art, but art has its part to play. My colleagues and I are excited to have this chance with the Creative City Strategy to think about public art's role in the city. And again, I'm grateful here to everyone here tonight on stage and in the audience for participating in this thinking. Thank you, and I'll hand it back to Christy.
Heichka, Eric. So I'd like to introduce our panel moderator for this evening, Vanessa Richards, artist, director, creative Together community engagement director at 312 Main. Yes. I'll let you intro yourself, Heichka. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Sounds like little raindrops falling. Rain. I was born on these rainy territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I am the daughter of Adelaide Patsak, whose parents came to Vancouver when the Second World War was starting. Our grandmother was half Jewish. My father is Rudolph Richards. He came to Vancouver as a student to attend UBC after he had been presenting at the Stratford Festival, their first World Arts Festival in Ontario. He came with a troupe from Trinidad and Tobago playing folkloric drum and dance music. And he came to Vancouver because one of his dear friends from his childhood in Port of Spain was here. And the reason he did not go to Toronto like every other Trinidadian is he felt that this territory called to him, that this land felt like the lushness of Trinidad and Tobago. I know this specifically because I always ask him, Dad, why did you go here? And he says, well, you know, you take a look at these mountains and you see the trees and the green and the ocean, and I say, you know, man, it looks like Trinidad. I'm feeling it. I say, my friend is there. I'm going to university. And I say, great. You go where all the other Black people are. But I have, since that moment of disgruntled teenagedom, come to really appreciate the choices that my parents made to have a family here. And the privilege of being shaped by this land has been growing and shifting and shaping my experience as a human, and as a human who's had the opportunity to travel and to be in other cities and in other wild places. And the impact of this land is becoming, at the same time, less mysterious as I come to understand the power of these territories and the way that they've been imbued with thousands of years of civilization, and furthermore, even more mysterious to how it is that I can feel in my own individuated way of this place, especially once I left it and carried it with me. I'm hoping that our conversations here today will go some way to both look at the historical presence and impacts of monumentalizing, making statues, making public declarations with art in public spaces, address our concepts of publics and look at the truths of that, but also cast forward some future truths that we might together here as friends and colleagues and people becoming friends, that we might share with the residents who occupy the Office of Cultural Affairs and work with us to shape the city we want, that we might share with them some of our good thinking and some of the ideas that matter at this time with these people that are here. And this is sometimes, this is your opportunity to not only represent yourself and these times, but to the best of our ability, thinking both globally the things that we might not be hearing in the room that we would like to hear more of. And one of the things that happened today, there's been a number of times that we've talked about what it means to make mistakes, what it means to consider out loud nuances that are taking shape. And I'm hoping that we can be fair, frank, and friendly in this conversation today. We're going to hear from 4 artists who will share their work and their ideas around redress, reconciliation, public space, public art, their personal experience, and their understanding of themselves in this global moment that we're in. But we'll also have an opportunity to have some thoughts with you out loud, and I invite us all to try and be as thoughtful as all of us always want to be, but also don't be too careful. I think we can get a bit stymied, and I invite us that if we do say something and they say, is that what I meant? Am I being too careful? Like, this is a time of velocity and urgency, and I'm excited about what we can do with urgency and velocity without necessarily being panicked, right? Given the times that we're in, it's really important, in my opinion, and I'm guessing other people might share this opinion, that we keep holding on, hold on to each other, do the uplift, do the reach back and the hold forward, and work it out. Can we do that? Great. I'm particularly interested in this subject matter, as I mentioned earlier, because of my own upbringing and how the land has shaped my experience of my life and my relationship to shape and form and color and temperature, and therefore how to be in the world, how to walk in the world. Right now it's Carnival all around the world, anywhere there are Catholics, and Lenten culture. So Germany has a carnival, Trinidad has a carnival, Austria has a carnival, Venezuela, and so on. And what's so interesting about the carnival celebration is that it invites the citizens and the residents, it invites the residents of any place to occupy their bodies and the land in very voluminous ways, in very playful ways, in very metaphoric ways, in very mythic ways, with a lot of permission to be fully self-expressed in ways that we moderate and stuff the rest of the year. So in the spirit of Carnival, I'm going to invite us to be as voluminous, and I'll stop with that. I just had a whole other moment going on thinking about Trinidad and Tobago Carnival, which was a huge experience in my own experience of making artwork in public places. I had the opportunity to work with some very fine carnival artists in the world, some of the finest, Peter Minchell, and also the time that I was in the UK for 12 years, we did a lot of public carnival artworks there for Notting Hill Carnival. And I'm happy to say it's been, and I think, one of the most interesting ways of occupying space on an annual basis, both with how the music shows up annually, how the sculptures show up annually, how the story of the carnival costumes are always a reflection of the times that we're in. So I'm hoping that we can have a little carnival bacchanal right here in this moment. And furthermore, as a Vancouverite, I've been really invested in what happens to daylighting blackness in the city of Vancouver as we consider the deconstruction of the Georgia Viaducts. And what does it mean as a Black woman to think about creating a Black village on unceded, unsurrendered territory? And how do we do this and cite this work in a way that is both Black-centered from the Black community to this wider city, and we think about Black cultural production globally, and we think about one of the opportunities that this city holds, which is a very broad and wide African diaspora showing up right now. So as a volunteer board director for the Hogan's Alley Society, these are things that I'm experiencing in a profound way with the colleagues with whom I work. And furthermore, with my work as transforming the former Vancouver Police Headquarters at 312 Main into a co-working community space. And what does it mean to be transforming a building with such a huge public persona? And how do we invite art into that conversation to help transform that space? So that's a little bit of some of my interests, and now I would like to invite you to see who's on the stage with me. So what I would like to do is I will say a line about everybody that's on the stage here, and then I will introduce them in the order that they will speak. They will say something more about their practice for about 10 minutes each. 10 minutes each. Our first speaker will be Dylan Robinson. And Dylan is an assistant professor, Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Arts at Queen's University. So he will be speaking to you first, and we will hear from Marcia Crosby, legend, curator, writer, legend, researcher, PhD, art history and cultural theory at UBC, legend. So we will hear from Marcia. And we have another legend in the house. What a pleasure. Laiwan, right here in front of us, an artist and teacher. She's at Goddard College, and she's a founder of the Ore Gallery just right around the corner. Thank you, Laiwan. And then we hear from legend in the making, Arash. Yeah, Arash. Arash Khakpour, co-founder of Press Paradise, co-founder of the Biting School. So I will invite you to make a round of applause to make them feel good at first before they even start. Yay! Ooh, ooh. And Dylan Robinson, would you kindly tell us something about your work and relationship to the subject?
This is, yeah, okay, this is working, good. E chwalalt, il tol squich, tlitzel qua matsqui, Barbara Holman thol tal, Ruth Gardner thol sisalush, equus haquiletsit siwas tis sialaquash. So, hello, everybody. I am so happy to be here in Halkamalum. What I just said was who I am and who my family is. My mother, Barbara Holman, and grandmother, Ruth Gardner from Matsqui. I grew up here just outside of Vancouver in Surrey, but I've been living away from home for quite a long time. Now based in Kingston, Ontario. And it's great to be back. It's great to re-engage with some of these questions that I've been thinking about for a while about Indigenous presence, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh presence here in the city of Vancouver, how that is envisioned and not, and realized and not, and how we might move forward to, as Indigenous peoples broadly. So I should back up a little bit and say, I grew up here. I am Stalo from just outside of Vancouver, but my family has always had connections to the people's relations here, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I, from that perspective, am very excited about this moment now of thinking through what the role of public art is for Indigenous peoples, particularly for Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh peoples here in the Lower Mainland, in creating work that is not just by us, by Indigenous peoples, but for our communities as well. That's of primary importance. One of the things, of course, that makes Vancouver unique, I would say, amongst Canadian cities is the presence of Indigenous work within the city, within the infrastructure of the city, the sort of visibility. But as was mentioned this morning, quite often that visibility is not of the peoples whose lands this is, but has been Northern First Nations and Indigenous work from further afield in Canada, and much of that is amazing and great work, but it does not represent the histories of this place here, and so that is incredibly important. Another thing I wanted to mention briefly is to return to the idea of, or to think through the idea of publics. So who is the public? And or publics in the plural. And I wanted to note that for many Indigenous peoples across these lands, the lands, the waters, our relations, the birds, that which is living in this place is part of our public. So we need to, it is alive, it has life. And so when I think about public art, I think about how that work serves that life. To what extent it is in relation with that life. To think about the history of the city that in many instances covers over, is built upon that life. And the work, the hopeful future of thinking through what potential public art has, art in the city and in all kinds of rural spaces as well, how that might be able to shift in a way, to reorient what we consider to be the public, or who this work is for, what we're doing this work for. That also includes, in that sort of broader concept of publics, Indigenous publics. So, to think about work that serves firstly and foremost those communities that are here, and I would say not simply, or not maybe not simply, but not exclusively through a making visible of the histories of Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh peoples here, but actually reworking the infrastructure, the very fabric of the city itself, so that it serves the people here. That is so important, and really speaks to the, I would say, the extent to which we need to move further. Paul Salem was talking about, this disruption. Like, where do we set the bar for that right now? Where do we set the bar for public art is our conversation right now too, right? Who are the communities we're in relationship with, and who does this work serve? And I really believe that it needs to move strongly in this direction. And thinking even further about, what is the sovereign space? What is the sovereign Indigenous space within the city? What might that be? What might that look like? And those are questions to be worked through by the nations here, the communities here, to determine what what will be most useful, because that answer is predicated upon the work that is already being done, the work that is perhaps more challenging to do, that isn't moving quite fast enough, perhaps, that could be furthered by using resources, by resources being offered to support whatever that work is. And I guess finally, the last thing I'd like to say is that the focus this morning on our languages, and I'm a language learner. I make mistakes all the time. I wish I had more time to devote to languages. I wish there was more of a presence, I would say as well, of our languages within the city, within the spaces that we walk in every day, and that presence can mean, as has already happened to a certain extent, the writing of our languages in public spaces. But also today I was reflecting on the opportunity to hear our languages within public space. And especially for language learners, the importance of having that, of being surrounded and feeling empowered by the presence of our languages. And being able to hear that, to hear our voices and feel that is part of our daily experience, and especially in many cases where, especially my generation, my mother's generation, have not had the opportunity, have not had, I should say my mother's generation, my grandmother's, not the same kind of access to language learning. That they would have wanted through university or formalized education. I can see this being a very important thing, to embed the sound, like literally the sound of our languages through whatever technology that might be, directional speakers, or there's a lot of ways that might be done, so that it actually honors the life of our languages in the life of this place. So I think maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you kindly, Dylan. Dylan Robinson. So we'll hear from each of our guests, and then we'll have a little conversation here, and then we'll open it to the floor. So do feel free to keep your thoughts and your questions in mind. If you've got a pen and paper, if you need something like that, there's some paper on these chairs here, which I think could now be available. Probably borrow a pen from anybody if you need it. Marcia Crosby. What are your thoughts on this?
Am I on? Yes.
You are.
Okay. Hello. I am Marcia Crosby. I was born and raised in a small fishing town in the north, Prince Rupert, with an extended family, which included my maternal Masset Haida grandfather, my maternal Tsimshian grandmother, my Skidegate Haida father, and my mixed Haida Tsimshian mom. I had 5 siblings and a cousin who lived with us. We all lived together in my grandparents' house. My father had 10 siblings, as did my maternal grandfather. So almost all of our relations worked in the fishing industry. So we saw them on this side of the water, on the mainland, or in Haida Gwaii and other places. Other family members included First Nations who had married in to our family, and I guess we with them, we into theirs, including the Giksan from the Skeena and Nishka from the Nass River, Sishat from Vancouver Island. And every summer they would, well actually in the spring, they would come to town to fish or work in the canneries, so many of them would stay at our house to visit or to stay a few days. So this is I never really thought of it before, because if you in the north, you go by your mother's people's lineage. So even if I have all these Haida people in my family, I go by my mother's people. And they are Tsimshian, they are killer whales. Here's my killer whale gold bracelet. I might have to cash it in one day to pay for my mortgage. we grew up with everybody coming to our house. And that included, like, my mom would tell us stories about all the different ones she would meet when she was fishing. And both my grandparents had, gill netters and trollers. My dad had seiners, as did all his brothers. And so you have to think about the Northwest Coast in terms of mobility. The people are moving around. They're going not just back and forth up north, but they would go down south often. They come here because a lot of people were in residential schools in the south, and so when they came to Vancouver, they were quite familiar with the surroundings. And in fact, my mom had two brothers, and my Uncle Teddy, he married Corinne Joseph. She was the daughter of Chief Moses Joseph. Well, I didn't know all that, of course. I've learned that since. But so when the first time I ran away from home with a kid, I was 17. Where did I go stay? Oh, I came to Vancouver, but I stayed in North Van with all my relatives there. And so I feel very at ease with moving back and forth. I travel back up north. I used to all the time, but my parents have both died in the last few years, so I haven't gone since my mom passed. But I drive to Alberta to see my son, and I have 6 grandchildren, and so I stay here. And I think we were talking about what did people do with their careers? Well, I didn't go to school till I was 36. Then I got a BA, and then I did a BFA, and then an MA, and then I taught for 16 years in a school. And that was a really amazing privilege because I taught in what was then Malaspina University. So I got to work with the Coast Salish people, the Shnannemoch and the Cowichan people there. Sorry, I'm getting over the Coast Salish thing. As she said, don't just say we're Coast Salish. So I'm being more specific. But I worked with Ellen White and Ray Peters. They took us out into the river before we started teaching, and they cleanse us for our work. And many, many students were injured. And it was interesting because the people who spoke the most about their injuries weren't the Native people. But First Nations really did have a lot of heartbreak, and really, I taught people who were older than me and my age. And they were the first generation of people whose children didn't have to go to residential school. Some couldn't write, so we would have weekend workshops in my house because I lived in the middle between Cowichan and Nanaimo. And that really meant a lot to me living there. And Ellen White, when people were injured, she would even do healing on them in the classroom. She'd put them right up in front and she'd do the healing on them. I don't think everybody believed in that or agreed with it, but she was a very strong, amazing, beautiful woman. And she kept a close eye on all of us people who were from elsewhere. So this is me turning more toward like, what did I learn from the places where I've lived down here? And I learned to surrender to their beliefs and their ways of life. And I learned to, I really hated religion because I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness, and they practice shunning, and so it really was a lot, really terrible. So at first, I really just saw the elders as this idea. You know how reconciliation has been constructed by the federal government and, monies and all that sort of thing? My belief, my ideas. I get a bit tired of that. But there was this whole movement about elders at the time, and it was something that was moving through museums where people were deciding who were elders and who were not. Whereas when I got to working with people in Shnannemoch territory, I met real elders. I met people that worked in the big house. I met big time spirit people, and they brought me in. And you know what, you can say you don't believe all you want, but once you go in there, you do. It's just the truth of it. So I feel very fortunate to have known that. And even at a time when I got really sick, one of the elders said, we should put Marcia in the big house. And Ellen White says, no, she has her own people and her own ways of life. So she embraced me in a really good way, and then recognized that I would find my own way, and certainly I did. And that was the same as when I started working on my PhD. I wanted to look at First Nations relations with other people in the city. It was really important to me because I knew everybody came down here. And my thesis was not based on theory. And I've read a lot of theory, but it is almost like a dream. It evaporates very quickly if it's not grounded in something. My ground was really my own experience. I knew all First Nations people in the North. We would meet everybody in canneries. So that's where my Uncle Teddy met my Auntie Corrine, who was from Squamish. I knew that they all traveled down here. I knew everybody that came up and stayed with us. So I knew that there was a lot of inter-First Nations relations. And when I did my PhD, I actually found that it was true. And I did it, I just want to say this, I found this one quote where this Northern First Nations Tsimshian man from Lakwalams, there was a story in a newspaper in Australia, because that's where I got most of my information, because they produced a lot of stuff on the Northwest Coast. So I find this thing, and it said, oh, and he said to him, we're going to go see the king, and we're going to get our rights back. And I thought, oh, that was just like 2 lines. I wonder if it's true that they met each other. And so I just looked, and sure enough, they did. I found every image in every situation where they could know each other. And the thing that really heartens me the most is that I knew where to look because I knew my own history. I knew my own family. I knew I knew who I knew in my huge family, thousands of relatives, truly, intimately. So I thought, well, it's possible. Now, if he came here to Vancouver, what would they have done? Oh, they would have gone and talked to the chiefs down here, right? So let me see if I can find that. And my knowing about kind of what I knew from my own personal history really helped me move through the maze of doing a PhD, which took way too long. But anyway, that's enough of that. Do I have 2 more minutes? How am I? I just want to say a couple of things that really touched me this morning. Was listening to Debbie Sparrow talk about the value of the land as weaving and saying, I didn't know, my grandfather never told me. And he said to her, you didn't ask, but she said, I couldn't ask because I didn't know. And the more I learned about our history through university, I started to remember things that my grandparents did in the house, and I started to recognize that they came from our traditional pasts. And so it opened up a whole other avenue to me. I was heartened by the fact, and I'll just say this and then I'll stop. I was heartened by the fact that what Carleen said, she said Kilsium, the other speaker, she said he's a language warrior. And what warrior means to me is to stand strong in your gift. And I love that because my gift has always been art and writing. And I used to really love law, not so much anymore, but I still like making things. And she said her gift was she learned quickly to use the language of lands and waters. So I want to, maybe we'll come back to that when when we have a larger discussion here. That's it. I'm done. There's more, but maybe we'll talk later.
Thank you very much, Marcia. I appreciate, I feel like your relationship to the land is peopled. It's this, I saw thousands of people all up and down the coast as you were telling your story about this moment in this land and these times. Laiwan, could you say something, please?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me here today. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry I have a bit of a cold, so...
We're sorry too.
And I want to say first, I'm very grateful to be here on Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh lands. is a refuge to me to be here. A little bit about where I come from. I was born in British colonial Rhodesia when it was under apartheid and with legalized white nationalism. So the first 15 years of my life was growing up under apartheid. We left in 1977 because of the escalation of the war. It has really framed how I am in space, how every public space is highly negotiated because of my experience of apartheid. This question that we are given today, which is how do artists claim public space, or how do artists create work in public space? And I'd like to problematize this a little bit as a settler who has found refuge in unceded lands. The question of space is highly political, and in what ways do we occupy such space? It is my belief that we need to step aside as settlers. We need to make space for the indigenous peoples of this land. And so I'm very careful when I make public work or when I make work, in the sense that in my practice as an interdisciplinary artist, I question what is interdisciplinarity. For me, interdisciplinarity is an expansion of consciousness. And this is something a little bit of what Dylan was talking about in relation to how are we in service to the lands and the animals and the peoples who are here, and how do we give them space? On some levels, an expansion of consciousness is related also to liberation. Whose liberation are we making art for? In some ways, as a settler, as an immigrant here, as a foreigner, my work has really been a research into colonialism, the violence of colonialism, especially coming from Southern Africa as I have, and the recognition that maybe there are 4 colonies left in the world, and these are Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand, probably. And so coming from a place that found its liberation in 1980, it is now Zimbabwe, I come from this different perspective, a perspective that looks upon what is colonialization, what is the violence that has happened. And I should say perhaps a little bit about how I, as a Chinese person, arrived in Southern Africa, which is my grandfather left China because of poverty in the late 1800s. And that poverty was an effect of the Opium Wars. So we know the Opium Wars was when the British sort of smuggled in opium, and the Chinese people became addicted to it, and the whole social fabric of China and the dynastic culture of over 5,000 years collapsed. So there is that kind of violence and disruption, disenfranchisement of cultures due to colonialism that I think has caused a migration of a lot of peoples internationally. And we witness that continuing today, the migration and the refugees that are happening internationally. So in terms of public art, I'm very interested in the urgency that we're in today because of climate change. How do we address how we are in the world? What kind of public art can we make that brings to light what Dylan was talking about in relation to making visible perhaps the lives that are already here. So an example I will give is perhaps a project I did in 2014. It's a commission from the Vancouver Heritage Foundation. It was for the CBC wall. And interestingly, a year before this project, I was haunted by this image that I saw on the internet. And it's basically this water, and there was a bridge. And I didn't know where this water was, and I didn't know where this bridge was. And when I applied for this project, I said I wanted to do something about water within the built environment of the city. And I have this image. And so when I was talking to the archivist at the CBC Media Archives, Colin Preston, and I showed him the image, and he said, "Oh, okay, here, look at this." And it was a video. And it was a video from 1956, actually it was a film, from 1956, and it's called Summer Afternoon. And this film, Summer Afternoon, follows two young Chinese boys adventuring through Chinatown. And at some point, they run down a dock, and then they're facing this water, and there's this bridge, and this is the bridge that had haunted me the year before. And it landed up to be the Georgia Viaduct. So this is kind of also coincidentally the year that the city began talking about maybe bringing the Georgia Viaduct down. So it was kind of coincidence. And so I created this mural for the CBC wall. But for me, a project is never simply that product. It is a process of what I'm calling entanglement. It's bringing in a lot of different elements and entangling them together. And once that piece was up, the archivist said to me, "Why don't you search for Chipper Maar?" And Chipper Maar is one of the boys in the film. And I said, okay, so I put out the word, I'm looking for Chipper Maar. So in the film, he's 10 years old. And about a year later, I get a phone call from a relative and says, "I know where Chipper Maar is." And so finally I got to meet Chipper Maar. He's 72, and he lives around the corner from my house. So this is where I'm thinking, okay, I'm just following this. I'm just in service to this water. And these are the stories that are coming out from it. So Chipper and I are now working together. We're going scene by scene through the film, the 30-minute film, and we're looking at all the locations in Chinatown. So I'll give you an example. There's a parking lot next to CIBC on Pender Street, and there's an alley. So there's alley, parking lot, CIBC. That parking lot was his father's fish store, the Liangsheng fish store, and it's now a parking lot. And so this tracing, this remapping of the changes in Chinatown, the gentrification, the neoliberalization of Vancouver as a city, all of these things come into play in this project. So I'm going to leave it there, but that's one of the approaches to a public artwork that I've taken recently. And in particular, I just want to say that something that's really interesting to me is the other than human. So in this regard, it's the water that was False Creek that came up, right up to behind the Sun Yat-sen Gardens, which is now the Andy Livingston Park. The Andy Livingston Park is now a astroturfed soccer field. So to understand that all of that was water at some point, and part of the project Fountain was also looking at the hidden streams that are in Vancouver, some of them that are being daylighted now, and that these streams are homes to salmon. And we see that with Still Creek, where the salmon have returned. So that the other than human is of very interest to me, particularly in relation to what Donna Haraway calls the human exceptionalism. So in what ways can we refocus art and public art to the lives that are surrounding us, that are our relations, but which, you know, Western civilization up to now has been paving over. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Laiwan. I'm interested finding out when we get to the conversation part, Eric, if this conversation about public art includes non-permanent works as well too. Okay, thank you. I also had the opportunity to do a little bit of work with Colin Prescott at CBC. Has he retired since? Okay, because my father and mother did a documentary that was in the CBC archives, which was centered on my father's black body in Vancouver and the difficulty he had in housing, and then the strange exotification of his Trinidad dance, which was a Orisha dance, the gods and goddesses of the pantheon of the African diaspora, based in Yoruba culture, and is a snake dance. So the otherworldliness of both his body, but a body that was being other than human and being of the land, like carrying this snake dance into a living room in Vancouver in 1965. Quite a thought, quite an image. Arash, a dancer. What have you got for us to share?
Well, thank you. Wow, I sound very loud now. Yes, my name is Arash. It's a pleasure to be here. I also want to acknowledge these two artists also there who are working, so thank you for what you're doing. It's very fascinating. I've been fascinated all day by their work as well. Yeah, my name is Arash. I'm originally from Tehran, Iran. I moved to Vancouver. I actually immigrated to the Coquitlam and Stolen Nation 14 years ago when I was 14. So I'm 28 years old now. Yeah, to a place where that was lived on at least 10,000 years ago. So it is a very strange feeling to have moved there 14 years ago and call this home. In a way, before I also start, I just wanted to also, in connection to this conversation, talk about the people who have inspired me directly with their work and public artwork and practices, or Chris Bowes, Cease Weiss, Crystal Smith, Valiant Jules, Michelos Tucci, David McIntosh, who's one half of Battery Opera, Lee Souffet, who's the other half of Battery Opera Performance, and also Heather Lamoureux, who runs the Vines Art Festival. And that in a way, the impact of these people is in my work as well. Yeah, I started dancing in a way which, if I think about it, in the mosque, in the sort of learning the movement of being in the trenches. So it's sort of interesting that I think about that as the first time of dancing, and it being on the ground and on the earth, and how that really the threads of dance and what dance means to me starts from being on the ground and on dirt, and violence and masculinity and war, and so much of that is also in my work. So yeah, I'm a dance artist, body-based practice, contemporary dance, and it's really about, I feel like my practice is about locating fear and resistance in the body, and what that means in the context of where I am and who I am, and also what it means in society. And I see dance as a tender weapon. Yeah, and speaking of the trenches. And also dance is a form of resistance for me and not a form of conformity. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. So public art. We started, actually my company started with my brother Ario, The Biting School, with the first work is called Cain and Abel, which is also based on a story that's in Bible and Quran, which is based on violence again, the first murder of history. And it was really, for us, was a question of like, what does it mean to be here? Who are we as men, as masculine bodies, or at least perceived that way, to take space? And this performance was happening at the King and Queen statue at a park, Harbor Green Park, and it was the King and Queen. So we thought, well, we're brothers, we're Cain and Abel, and so it seemed to be effective because it actually stopped traffic and people were watching. It was by the water. It was about him and I repeatedly killing each other over and over, and see the implication of that and the response of that to the public. So showing that as a real thing and say, well, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about this again? How do you feel about this again? The implications of power. And that in a way, our company is also based on that, this idea of the fact that Cain, who has built this civilization on his own, is a murderer. And there's blood on his hands. And how we learn to deal with things through violence. So yeah, it's a lot about proposing the problem through the performance in public and not solving it for the public. And then I also thought about talking about the project which happened with Chris Bowes and David McIntosh of Battery Opera called Terroir Tour, that really had a big impact on me as a person. Thank you. As an immigrant here, as an uninvited person who is landed in this without choosing to come here and not knowing anything before. So this project was based on 2-week trips to the interior and to meet Chris, who's a Sequem artist and lives in Kamloops. A really great, inspiring artist. And David, who has a long-standing relationship with him, got us actually to travel through there with a car and read stories that are connected to where we're traveling, actually. And to be able to actually feel what that is by being there and reading the stories. And where that, I mean, it's like, one is understanding, okay, what does it mean, colonization? Okay, I read it, okay, I get it. But then actually feeling it, I think that for me was the first time and the most impactful time where I actually felt that, oh, I'm here and I don't know what I have to do here, where I'm standing. And that would be an example of relationship building that happened over the years through David and Chris, that allowed us to connect and connect to Chris through going to walks and talking about his nation and sort of learning about land and his culture. Also want to talk about Press Paradise. I have 4 minutes, probably. I have 3 minutes. 3 minutes, okay. Thank you. I forgot to press my phone play. For timer. Press Paradise. Press Paradise started as a group of us, 4 of us, first 5, as a group where we wanted to, again, in public, not asking the public to come to the theater, but actually going to the public. And one of the projects which was really interesting was going to Yaletown, which it seemed to be one of the most difficult places to perform in. Interestingly enough, and it was Canada Day, and we didn't want to actually perform anything. So we decided to go actually do a personal acknowledgement with a megaphone in different places in the city, where in a building or in a Starbucks or in a hotel, and seeing if you can take space, actually call for the space for that minute and a half, and acknowledging where I'm standing and what I'm doing and who I am in relation to this land, is standing inside this building on this land. And that was very interesting because it created conflict. Speaking of interruption in spaces, what Press Paradise does is, it's really, the work is about sort of allowing the body to be in space to surface the conflict and discomfort and questioning the peace and the calm of the space. So the body as an interruption in the space, it seemed to be sort of important there. And that was when also I was moved again. So again, talking about public performances with people who are not expecting it, there was so much conflict. People didn't want us to talk at all, didn't want to be in places. We were getting kicked out for speaking for a minute and a half, an acknowledgement. And so it's like, wow, this is where we are. People don't even want to hear it. And there's people, what do you mean? What does acknowledgement mean? And this is only about 3 years ago. So that was also really interesting to experience, that there's people that don't want to hear it. And what do I do about that? And who am I in that context? I also, 1 minute, is that right? Nice. Yeah, that was fast. I hope we've got some people awake at least. Also, I was just thinking about decolonization in the practice of dance and theater. That can be very much about the spectacle. That is what's really tiring me out about performance in theaters and as well. And I just think about how we bring groups together, that our practices can be decolonizing, and how that really calls for unknown experiences, where we can't really know exactly what's going to happen if you're asking to collaborate with someone. And if you want their body in the room, you can't know everything, you can't control everything. So learning ways to work with that, and that it allows for us to not know everything. And which requires checking in regularly, and that it is process oriented. Thank you.
So we're going to sit with that for a moment. I'm going to take a cue from my sister Jocelyn's invitation today to just sit after we've heard. So we will for a moment. There's a few times when we get to be silent together. Sometimes it's in grief, sometimes it's in prayer, but it's not typically at a conference. And so when Jocelyn introduced that today, I'm like, I'm down with that. Every week I lead a drop-in choir, and after we finish singing, there's this palpable silence that is one of the most delicious parts of having been very noisy together. And I think, DB, you would probably recognize that in any of the music makers, players of instruments in the room. After you've given the sound, then to sit with that other moment. And I also appreciated time to think collectively and individually in this moment. And I'm wondering if our esteemed guests, I'm hearing a little thread around violence. not so much in your presentation, Dylan, but I think that it would be, I think there's something there still. But I'm going to swing back to what I heard maybe emerging inside of what some of your thoughts might be, Dylan. This idea of land populated like these, we didn't speak of sculptures, we didn't talk about installations, we didn't talk about all the other ways we might typically imagine a public artwork. We talked about a land peopled with stories. We talked about the body in space. We talked about what it is to see bodies in space through a time in a city that changes, and the monuments were the built environment and the destruction of that environment, as opposed to poodle on a stick, as an example. And the poodle on a stick is going to bring me back to this question I have about thanks Terry, circuitous. When we think about the role of public art, and what I'm hearing from the thinkers here on the stage is I'm wondering, you're all talking about relationships to people, families, and other than humans. And how does that show up in the future works that this city might produce and support in terms of public artworks? What is and how does a temporary, body-based public expression stand toe-to-toe with something that monumentalizes or something that occupies the side of a building or the other physical impositions on space that public art can take? Furthermore, with the kind of content that I hear you thinking about, I wonder, what is our responsibility to the kind of conversations we want to have for the future and the way that children experience work in the public realm? Because there's this charm, this idea about how the boys in your movie were moving through this space, and then with this urgency of this time, with insect collapse and all the honeybees and the planets and the waters and the butterflies that drink turtle tears. How do we have these big, terrifying conversations in a public space, in the many publics? This is how I'm circling back to you, Dylan. These many publics that are also children, and that they're also the walking wounded and the terrors and the traumas and the triggers, and how do we talk about the big stuff without terrorizing public space? Or maybe we want to.
In my, not all of the work I researched was in my dissertation, but one of the things that I really looked for and that I knew happened here for a certainty was that many First Nations, and this could apply to anyone, I think, that came from away, because it's not like because you're First Nations or that there's inter-First Nations naturally. I could come here and feel comfortable because I knew people, actually knew people and was related. But then that wasn't true when I went to work on the island. So when I was looking at the relationships that people had, and this is more in terms of performance in the city. This is a religious or a Christian, culturally produced based bands that were both political and performative. And they were there also for entertainment, and all of the city's Diamond Jubilees, Golden Lisser, like there was always something. But when I looked, I asked what were the common interests that engendered particular, and I'll say inter-First Nations, but just interrelations with people in the city. What engendered those relationships? When Indigenous laborers worked and or lived in other First Nations lands and waters, so you have a job, right? And I'm gonna go work in I know this is your place, but actually the federal government says I have to fish in these same waters as you. So how do we show respect to one another? And I think that's kind of almost a city thing. It's certainly a metropole kind of, question. And they did. And so I thought that was interesting. And they did use art often to bring themselves together. People traveled with their musical instruments. People danced. When people came and stayed at my grandparents' house, they would often, everybody could play musical instruments because they were all, most went to residential school and they all played. Grandpa played violin, my grandma, everybody played piano or something. So there was always arts, there was always singing. People sang in their own languages, whatever they were. It doesn't have to be First Nations. I know this for true. And they created, I argued, and I know that this is true because they created new cultural spaces together for themselves in the city. And they did this by using urban-based networks with each other. Because sometimes so-and-so from Haida Gwaii would be here, or so-and-so from Duncan would be here, or, there would be different people here. And so they create this network of people. And they, when I say urban, I mean to encompass cities, towns, labor sites, because that was a big thing in early Vancouver. You could hop on a bus and you could go all the way out to Chilliwack. So there were dances out there. People traveled all over the mainland. That was not uncommon. They had boats, they had canoes, they had all kinds of ways to get around. They had steamers. So there are all those kinds of things that enabled people to come and work together. And the other part too was, I just want to say this one thing about, I think it was Dylan, no, not Dylan, who was that said this morning, he says, Stop saying for Coast Salish territory, because it's Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish. The others are in Vancouver Island, the others across the border. But when I looked at that, and I thought about, they had a discussion also about Stanley Park. Of course, nobody gets around the topic of whose land it is, because we know that, that's still a heated discussion. But I do know, and I'm from reading thousands and thousands of images, that I could almost date all the people who were in Stanley Park and how much space they took out at any given moment. And I know the date, I know the exact celebration when Squamish people and Musqueam people and they were erased from that space, and when it ended. So it's very interesting to me that if you start looking at where there was public production that included relationships with others. Also, the other thing too is, say I would show my parents, I'd say, oh, look at this, where were you guys? Oh, we were it was a Chinese restaurant that it's really well known, it's a W. But my aunt, who has dementia, she's like 90, she goes, oh, we were at so-and-so restaurant. Well, it was the only restaurant where Aboriginal people could go and actually have a drink and dance. So in the post-war era, Chinese relationships were really important, and I know that there were many of the people, Chinese restaurants, and owners were good friends of the people in the two reserves just right across Burrard Inlet. So there's piles of information on interrelationships between newcomers, other First Nations, and I think they've always been open to it. And he just said, just know where you are. And
so, Marcia, are you talking then about the kind of public art production that happens in common life, everyday citizens making work and then punctuating space and being able to look back and clock that historically, and that might be one of the indicators that we want further more of in this city moving forward? I'm going to think about what do we want to see moving forward in 2030 in this city? Do we want? I'm so down with more people making more art and putting it everywhere, whether it's a presence of music.
I think it was Kelsey said this morning. He said, you know what? Not only stop saying Coast Salish territory, but be specific. But he also said, get permission. Yeah. Whatever your projects are, get permission from the three nations. Why and for what? For employment. to secure employment. If your work includes their land or something about who they are, prioritize, incorporate, and create visibility for our people, especially in Stanley Park. And we know because that is a central place where art is put up. And we've seen it on billboards. We know historically that the many people from our Kwakwaka'wakw had relationships with people from North Vancouver, from both of the two. There was a period of time before 1923 when the Tsleil-Waututh were also lived in the same village as people from Eslan and the other place. Eslan and Musk. No. The one that Eslan was the. Yes. Yeah. I always just called them CAP because my aunt CAP Reserve and the Mission Reserve. So the Mission Reserve is actually Eslan, and the CAP is Holmichiston. Is that right? Yeah. I never get that right. So. But I agree with those comments made this morning. It's like, and I want to say this. This was a weird thing that happened. Somebody handed over my dissertation, and it's embargoed. You can't. Nobody's supposed to, because I knew that it had a lot of people from Squamish, Musqueam in it. Not Musqueam so much, just Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh. But I made sure I kept everything in public places. Mm-hmm. And I only wanted to talk about where they engaged in public places. I didn't want to encroach on anyone's territory or history. I didn't want to, talk about things I shouldn't. But my whole dissertation was given to this guy who ran a very important gallery. And this is just the same year as I graduated and I was burnt out.
And this is about the public art aspect?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom had just died, and I still went ahead and wrote a piece for Lawrence Paul, and then I finished and I was just dead, and then then we're going to do this. But all of a sudden, when I heard I had to meet with all of them, I actually felt really sick, because I actually did feel afraid, because I didn't want anyone to think I wanted to work all that out on my own. But once it was out in the public and brought to this and I still haven't worked it out. So actually listening to them this morning was very helpful to me. I felt calm. I thought, it's okay. You'll do it or you won't do it. You'll publish what you can or you won't publish it. You did everything in integrity. And if it's out of line, they'll tell you. And they'll say it in a good way, the way they said it this morning. And I am very, very grateful that I listened to everything today.
Yeah.
It was really important, a really important that was hours, right?
Thank you for your words.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Marcia. I have maybe 2 minutes left to hear any comments that we might have from the floor or from the stage here. And then I'd like to have a question from the floor for our guests, please. Please.
I just wanted to just mention something about public art, and how I don't know how it sounded, but I talked a lot about violence and putting it in front of the public. And I don't believe in terrorizing the public either, but there's times that we have to ask, what does it mean putting the body there? Like, the body it holds life, and by putting it there, it can be traumatic for some and not for others. And so, I just feel that being here these years, I feel that we're scared of feeling so much. And I think that's why art is interesting, because the performers acting, for example, is dramatic, but it's based on life. And they're feeling things, but they seem like they're not real because they're really feeling things. And we don't want to do it, we just want to watch it. So, and I think that has to do with public art and how we can show up and seeing what that transaction, that connection, that conversation with the public, especially if they don't know it's coming.
And it's not on a stage.
Yeah.
And this Terroir Tour book that David McIntosh made, I'm so excited to know you were part of that, because I think it's one of the best books I'd read on British Columbia history, period.
I agree.
I bought 20 copies, not a word of a lie. I gave it to all of my friends and to guests when they came. Terroir Tour.
Terroir Tour, it's a book. Yeah.
And what's interesting, because it's a lyrical verse recollection of your presence, of being in public spaces and having these public engagements. And then I guess this takes us a little bit into when is something a public performance or a social arts practice or public art that monumentalizes a moment. Dylan, I see you, or please feel free.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what Marcia was saying, because I think one of the most interesting and exciting areas of public art development for me right now is around that relationality aspect, that social practice, as you just named, or discursive space, right? So how do we actually create spaces of gathering? As Marcia was saying, the relationships that develop, right, and that are forged, and histories that are shared are contingent upon having these kind of spaces, homes, places where we can come together. And for me, that's so important, because I always say, similarly to the way in which the settler Canadian public did not learn, in most instances through primary school, the histories, plural, of Indigenous peoples across Canada, so too I did not learn histories, protocols, languages of our peoples across these lands. And so for me, it is so important right now, I think, and there's lots of really exciting conversations going on about intercommunity between Indigenous nations, conversations about sharing space and histories, and working out those differences in protocol as well across. I mean, we cover the same distance as Europe. So there's that dramatic difference, I would say, in the way that, with all the sort of values that we share as Indigenous peoples across these lands, there are also some really important differences in histories and our protocols that we also, I feel, benefit from coming together around to discuss. So, we in this instance, I'm talking about Indigenous peoples, but of course that's also a we in other instances that include Indigenous peoples and newcomers, immigrants to these lands, and settler Canadians. But in this moment, I'm thinking particularly about intercommunity relationships as well. So I think that's really important, and I would like to see less of a kind of binary between, it's not a binary exactly, but an expansiveness around what public art can be in terms of offering space, to be defined in the ways that are of use for the peoples who have histories here, who are from here, and let that lead the way. Rather than a presupposition around, there's a wall that something can be put on. So yeah, that's what I'd like to say.
Thank you for your comments, Dylan. One exciting thing with the Hogan's Society that we're experiencing is that the new Nora Hendricks place that's opened up on the site that was Hogan's Alley has 52 spaces, 52 homes. The majority of people of whom are of African descent. The next group are African and Indigenous descent, and then Indigenous people together. So when we had our opening, we had the two drums together, and we're thinking about how that space becomes activated with both the conversation about, as Stephanie Allen said this morning, stolen peoples in relation to a stolen land, and what our modern time moment will be there. Laiwan, is there something you would want to add to this conversation at this moment? Can we take? Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Jocelyn.
Can I help you to collect some questions from our room?
I say that's fantastic.
I'd like to just name... Hi, everybody. I'm Jocelyn McDougall, and I have been working with Vanessa and a fantastic team to help design and facilitate our day today. I just want to name that we're looking to be in working closely with our City of Vancouver Playhouse staff.
Yeah.
And
good union staff.
Yeah, and so we're coming close to the end of our time. We'd also like to hear very much reflection from Christy Charles at the end, so we want to leave a bit of time for that too.
So my watch says 5 minutes.
So what I was going to propose is maybe I'll collect 2 or 3 questions from the audience all at once, and then we could have the panel choose which pieces they may like to answer.
Yeah.
How does that feel for you?
Yeah, and I think even just putting the questions in the room might be a gift unto itself too, that we can
Okay.
all sort of still stew on a little.
Okay, let's see, does anyone have a question that I could come and offer amplification for? I'll take 1 and 2.
Kilsalem said this morning that there wasn't a word for art in the languages of the three nations here. I was wondering if that reframes how we think about what we're talking about.
Not a word for
Bingo.
art in the local nations. Does that reframe what we're talking about?
Hi, maybe I'll just introduce myself. Dangwatla, how are you? My name is Vera Danik. I'm Skidikit Haida. I'm here as a guest of Christy Charles, actually, and I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And I've been here working alongside as sort of a delegate for an organization, an arts organization, Performing Arts, and attending Talking Stick Festival. And I missed out on this event earlier today, but I really wanted to kind of dig in from what I read here. And what does it mean body-based? What does that mean when you're focusing on the body? How are you bringing Indigenous bodies back into the spaces through your art? That was something that I wanted to sit with. What does that mean to you as individuals or artists? And then also the redress. Is it our job as artists to facilitate this redress, and what does that mean, and how do we sit with that term, and how do we build relationship with the communities in a way that we have proper consultation? Of course, acknowledging and asking permission is only the first steps. How do we build those good relationships, those meaningful relationships, so that we address the proper protocols and permissions, so that we're working with Indigenous people and not for them? So I'll just kind of leave that.
Thank you.
Perfect potency questions. Thank you, speakers from the floor.
I just know about art as not by artists. Basically it was made for, we'll talk about Tsimshians in particular. There was art, and it wasn't just the carvings or physical objects, but it was forms of performance. In fact, there was, they had this amazing, because they're living with this whole other spirit world force. And so the people who made all the objects that were used in winter dancing, which they would call up what is a nach, which is sort of like a spirit place. I won't say too much about it, but it was still, even though there was this whole spirit realm, they made it live in the what they wore. But one of the things that I really noticed, I thought, okay, what do you do if it's all supposed to be, in-house spirit stuff? What they did was they took winter dancing and they joined it with potlatch, which is something you do in the summer. So that's secular, and the other is, what's the difference? What's secular and the spiritual? So they joined the two, and they did it to meet with the king and queen, or the prince and princess. But I thought, how clever of them to wear all this regalia and join two very specifically different kinds of things. One territory, who you are, what you own, this spirit work, winter dancing, and put them together. So I do know, and so I think that is not having a word for it, but I know that people made up words for things once they, I know for a fact, in Squamish they built very particular kinds of totem poles that weren't part of, that looked more like Northwest Coast poles. So there is this whole shift. So maybe that's part of not presenting things that are spirit-based. And so they do it in a bit more of a vernacular, inter-First Nations way. That's just one comment I have about it.
Thank you.
thanks. Perhaps I could say a little bit about my approach to body-based. And I think that it's really important as a queer person of color who has gone through colonial violence to build a relation with bodily being somatically. In what ways do you have a somatic practice? In what ways do you learn voluptuousness and carnival, and how do you learn to take up space in a celebratory way when colonialism is all about your constraint and your minimalist, you're taking as minimal amount of space as possible. So I think in my practice, a body-based practice and how to become embodied in the world is to have a really compassionate relation with trauma and work through that trauma and do that work. That's really important because the body and the land are interconnected. To not have a violent relationship with the land means to not have a violent relationship with one's own body. And so to unlearn colonial extraction or any of those types of violences that we encounter in colonialism, we kind of have to learn a compassionate, somatic, body-based practice.
Interesting point, thank you on that. And check out Venezuela's live feed on their Carnival right now on how to work through trauma.
I just want to speak briefly to the no word for art question, and it reminds me that our songs are often forms of medicine, of law, of family history, act as the equivalent to books. So this is the way that we share our knowledge, and so the system of art, to think of it that way, is not an equivalent to those forms and song is just one of this. I mean, our the work we do in the Longhouse, all of this dance and oration is part of these other systems of law and medicine and documenting, telling our histories. And so I think that's incredibly important to remember, that there's a functional aspect here that kind of with our people as well, right? That this isn't a sort of a stage performance for audience in that way. And that's a really key difference. Said at the same time that we have amazing artists that are also working in those forms of performance to an audience. So they're not also completely, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but it is important to remember that song acts as something very different than a purely contemplative, relaxing pastime, perhaps.
Wow, a lot of living art in this public art conversation. I'm excited by that. Christy, where are you at? Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for your thoughtfulness. Arash, Marcia, Laiwan, Dylan, our signer, our visual respondent. Et voilà. I
just wanted to say thank you for your beautiful words that you shared, the knowledge that you shared with us this evening. I'm going to comment on a few things that you spoke of, and to show how I connect to the work that you've done and the communities that I come from. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge my ancestor. Damn, they're strong. My late uncle, Thomas Dapp. He was an Indigenous lawyer who graduated from Queen's University. Our language holds us strong. In many Indigenous communities, or communities that have been colonized, thank you so much. We experience a lot of loss and grief. And in the past few years, I stayed at home in my community because I experienced grief. My late father, Henry Charles, passed. My children's father also passed, and his father also passed in the past 3 years. And if it wasn't for our language, our ceremonies, our songs, our 51 salmon streams that used to exist on this land, where the salmon were so abundant that they would piggyback through the streams. These are stories that have been passed down that we still carry strong today. For 10 days when my father passed away, I was grieving and I didn't eat. I couldn't eat. I was so sad. But it wasn't until we had our final feast that everybody brought to me crabs, ooligans, halibut, clams, different types of candied, smoked, and barbecued salmon, that I was able to finally nourish my spirit, and I was able to stand strong. And it's only been 2 years since my father passed, and in our cultural ways, we have stages of grief. And I am just so thankful that I was able to grow up with this huelmoch privilege of living in my community, learning our language, sitting with our elders. And little did I know, I was like 4 years old when I was being babysat by the late Dominic and Rose Point from Musqueam, keepers of our knowledge. And I used to make fun of him. Oh, what are you doing with that stinky stuff? He used to make drums, and the hides were really stinky. And then it wasn't until I got older that I was learning the importance of the drum and connecting and singing these songs that bring us together. The language, the blanket term for the language that we speak is called Halkamelam. The dialect that I speak is Hunkaminam. Our relatives from upriver speak Halkamelam. And our family on Vancouver Island speak Halkaminam. And this connects us to who we are. We don't just speak our language. My late Papa Chosim, Andrew C. Charles, used to sit in the back of the language class at UBC. You can take First Nations language, Musqueam language at UBC, and now you can take Squamish language at SFU. And I want to say a shout out to our interpreters that are here this evening. They're just going to town with all their signs. I'm sorry if I'm saying something like, but it's the use of sign language that Squamish developed their program to teach the people. Because we didn't learn through textbooks and through phonetic alphabets. We learned orally, through visually, through teaching, through using our hands and our energy. The importance of the land is so important to our Musqueam people because our name, Humathqui, Humathquium, Muthqui is the grass that we come from. It's a specific type of grass that is now extinct because of pollution, industrialization. But that's who we are. When people travel from all these different territories and they'll see the wild cranberries, or they'll see the big, great gray cliffs in Point Grey, or they'll see the Muthqui, they'll see the wild roses. Oh, we're coming into the territory of the Musqueam people. So that's what it means when we're connecting to the land and to the language. And we're all fisher people here as well along the river. And the archaeological evidence, we call it the belongings of our ancestors, dates us back thousands of years. Reef netting is archaeological evidence of reef netting was found at Cessnam, 70th and Granville, and it's over 2,000 years old. I met a lady who lives on the river delta as well and is sustained by fish. And she said to me, oh, we do smoky fish too. smoked fish, like how we eat as well. Protocol, the reason why we use a protocol is not to just share with you and welcome you and give you permission to be here. But like our beautiful elder was saying, it connects us to who we are. I can go to another place and say, Antachachliat litan atla chumasquim, tanasalsitla e tsatzamkin e thathalamat. Chosim e thathalamat. And that brings me back generations and generations, even thousands of years. Oh, you're Christy Charles, you're from the Charles family because you said who your grandparents and great-grandparents are. And that's the importance of our protocol. It's not just to welcome. And our connection to minorities, to refugees, to people who have been pushed to the outskirts of our communities. Our connection goes deep. I have a tattoo on my arm to represent my connection to my cousins who come from the Hong family, who come from a result of that relationship of coming together in those hard times. When I was little, there was a restaurant in UBC called the Varsity, and it was owned by King, Bing, and Wing. And I got to sit there, and I had my own high chair in the back of the room, and I learned how to use chopsticks when I was like a year old. It's because of that, recognizing our relationships and our struggles and being together. I have so many notes. But where we are today, is the name that was given to this space here, Queen Elizabeth Theatre, as a place for gathering. And just to share with you a few of my connections to the public art pieces that we see around the city that we don't realize that maybe they're Musqueam, maybe they're Squamish, maybe they're a bunch of totem poles at Totem Park that don't represent us. I'll start at UBC. At the Museum of Anthropology, you'll see there's a house post there carved by Susan Point, and it represents our connection to the celestial beings. The mink that they're holding represents the connection to the supernatural world, and the stars and the moon represent our connection to the universe. And the red on the bottom represents our connection to the Tama, to the earth that we walk on. As Deborah said before, you can see many of our blankets. As soon as you get off the plane at YVR, you're stepping onto the traditional territory of the Musqueam people. You'll see the beautiful blankets hanging from the ceilings, the big, huge spindle whorl that would usually just be this size to spin the wool to make the blankets. And you'll see a male and a female welcome figure welcoming you to our land. And people are like, oh, that's cool, that's a nice blanket, that's a nice carving, but that's our history and our connection and our protocol through the regalia that we wear, how we adorn ourselves. And many places, but one thing that I would like to acknowledge is the redress. Today, what we're doing here, all of us coming together in this new community of making this change at the symposium. But a prime example of redress is Snewaith Lalem, Langara College. In 2016, they bestowed that name on there, Snewaith Lalem House of Teachings. They also offer a Coast Salish carving class where you can learn our form lines and woodcutting styles, jewelry making. And I actually feel bad because I'm missing class tonight. Deborah Sparrow is my instructor in weaving, Coast Salish weaving. I know we're not supposed to be using this term when we're addressing the lands, but the weaving styles that we carry in the Coast Salish nations are very similar. So she's teaching us the techniques that we use. And I apologize to her today for missing class because that is so important to me, to learn about who I am. I can speak the language, I can sing some songs, but to weave is a totally different thing that I'm learning. And I felt so bad because it's my obligation to learn that as a Musqueam woman, to pass it down to my 2 daughters, to put it on my son and my 2 daughters when they receive their names. But I was like, I have to be here. I have to say these things. We have to be a part of this change. And I also want to say thank you to Langara to creating a new piece of public art. At the end of last year, they raised a house post. And it's a woman in a blanket holding a spindle whorl, representing our connection to the land and our connection to weaving. And this post was dedicated to my late father, Henry Charles Sitsumpkin. And it was the most beautiful thing. It's the most honorable thing that you could do to remember our ancestor. And that's the last time, the first time since the 1900s when we raised the Kayapalano pole. So I just wanted to share my connections with you, raise my hands to each and every one of you. Geez, we're changing the world already. Here we go. So, Haitsepka, Nasiyam Nasiyaya. Much love. Thank you.
Thank you. Here we go.
Thank you so much, Christy. I'm just going to invite Maida Brown up to give us a sense. Maida Brown, cultural planner, visionary, stunning human unicorn, to come up and give us a sense of where we are in the context of the overall strategy.
Thank you, everyone, our guests, our folks who have stayed with us today. I just want to acknowledge that sometimes it's the city's job to get out of the way, so I'm going to try to get out of the way of your time pretty quickly. But I just want to thank you and say that it means so much to us to try to be good listeners and good hosts in new ways, where we can be more humble and try to understand what it means to be working more reciprocally with you as our community. To try to understand how we can become more receptive to the kinds of disruptions that people have been talking about, how we can understand that songs and language can hold medicine and law that can rework the infrastructure of our city if we learn how to listen better. And how to listen better on these unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. We have much to unlearn in our extractive and limited ways of working, and want to think about how we can allow work to happen in ways that don't limit your freedom to stand strong as in your gifts, that we don't get scared of feeling, and that we learn as a city to get comfortable with the kinds of discomfort that are necessary to try to have spaces like these where we can forge relationships that can hold bodies with more care than we've been able to do in the past. So that's what we're endeavoring to do through the process. Over the next set of weeks, we'll be trying to take many kinds of complex sharing that you all have offered us today, and think about how we can create a plan to work together over the coming years to work in better ways. We'll go to council in July, but we'll see you in April so that you can hold that pen with us as we try to think about how to do this in better ways. Thanks. Lara Honrado, our Assistant Director.
I just want to thank Meta and also echo her gratitude to all of you for being here. So I'm just going to say a few more thank yous. Thank you, obviously, all of you for being here and being part of this conversation. Thank you to our speakers and our moderator. Thank you to our Poet Laureate, Christy Charles. Thank you to Vocal Eye, Visual Interpretation, our facilitators, graphic recorders, all of our volunteers, the wonderful staff at Vancouver Civic Theatres who've been at the Playhouse all day since very early in the morning, making sure that we could make all of this space for all of these rich conversations. My colleagues in cultural services who are in the room and have been in the room all day today in these conversations. All the folks that have been with us in conversation, in dialogue, offering us critiques along the way as we get to the point where we will be presenting the Creative City Strategy in July. So thank you to everyone that continues to be engaged with us in all of this work. And again, thank you to all of you for being part of this with us. So maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat. Thank you.